This may end up becoming somewhat of a rant video, but before I get into my criticisms of the Sony cameras, I do want to mention that I really appreciate everything Sony has done in terms of pushing the industry forward. These cameras have some of the most incredible technology I've ever seen, and it's stuff I couldn't even imagine 10 or 20 years ago when I was first getting into the industry. Things like autofocus working flawlessly is something I didn't really think we would see as soon as we did. And Sony really pushed the limits of what's possible in terms of tracking and really locking on to autofocus in video. I look at these Sony cameras and everything they've done in terms of dynamic range and color and resolution, things like the A7R pushing the boundaries of what's possible in terms of resolution on a full frame camera, or things like the A7S when that first came out, and the low light capabilities of these models, and just making it accessible and easy to use for your everyday photographer or enthusiast, someone just getting into the industry, someone who wants to pick up a camera and shoot great images. Sony does that and beyond, and it's why they've really gained such a foothold in the industry, and their market share continues to grow. There are so many people shooting with Sony cameras because they love what they bring to the table in terms of technology, and I love them too for that very reason. These are cameras that I use when they are appropriate and the right tool for the job. So any criticism I have, please don't look at it as something like where I hate these cameras, I would never use them, I don't touch them. I do, in fact, actually use Sony cameras when they are appropriate for the job, but they're not my favorite camera for a lot of reasons that we're going to get into. And I kind of struggled with thinking of how I want to format this. Do I start with my main biggest criticisms, or do I start with the small little nitpicky stuff? And I think I'm going to actually start there. We can build up to some of the major flaws I see in these Sony cameras. And again, please hear me when I say that that doesn't mean they're unusable. They are great photography cameras, video cameras when used appropriately. And any criticisms I have are really just meant to be kind of a highlight of why I don't particularly find them enjoyable to use all the time, and why I might suggest, you or someone else, if these are also pain points for you, know that you're not limited to just Sony, right? There's Canon, there's Nikon, there's Lumix, there's Olympus. Olympus is kind of fading into the background, but there are options out there, and we're not stuck using just Sony cameras just because they check certain boxes. I think there's a lot of reasons to kind of complain and criticize what they've done in certain aspects of these devices. And there's a lot to celebrate, which I've already talked about. So we all know the great things about Sony, but my personal pet peeves that are maybe a little bit harder to see if you're just kind of, if you're a Sony shooter or you've used these cameras before, it just becomes kind of the commonplace to just adapt to the problems and not really see them. Where my favorite cameras are the Lumix ones, and when I shoot Sony, I'm always frustrated by some of the little things as well as some of the bigger things. So I guess I probably should just start talking about why I find these a little bit irritating to use. And the first and foremost is just the way, I know it's super tiny nitpick, but the way that the files are stored on the memory card. When you shoot a full day on a Sony camera and you bring it into the studio and you're going to copy your footage, you're presented with a card, a memory card that says no name, and a folder structure that I don't think anyone would actually say that this makes any sense to a human being. Compare that to other cameras where you plug in the memory card and it's what you would expect. Your JPEGs, your RAW files, your video clips, whether they're MP4 or MOV, doesn't really matter. But it's laid out in a way that's pretty easy to digest. It's one folder, usually DCIM, and there's your content right there. DCIM, I don't even know why that's necessary in this day and age. But regardless, if you plug a Sony memory card in, you're greeted with M4 root, clip, all sorts of random folders full of junk files that you don't actually need. And you kind of have to sort through it to get to what you're actually looking for, which is the content that you shot, whether it's your JPEGs, your RAW files, or your video clips. Now, I'm sure there's some reason, some software architecture, some coding reason why it is this way. But I think it's really silly that in 2024, 2025, we're still plugging in memory cards that say no name. They don't even say Sony. They don't even say the camera that they came from. Compare that to the Lumix cameras. When you format those memory cards, you plug them in, when it mounts on your computer, it says Lumix. And you get to see right away, oh, that's my Lumix card. Okay, great. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, it's not a huge deal, but it is the the minor friction that you get constantly every shoot after shoot after shoot. When you're plugging that memory card in, you're greeted with this kind of irritating folder structure. And then when you actually copy that over, you have to be aware. I've run into this problem many times now where I'll copy just the whole card over, put it on a hard drive, and then later I go to do my media management and I maybe back it up and archive it and try and delete that folder. And there's permission issues buried within this folder structure that you really have to dive in to figure out which file is giving me problems. Why can't I delete this folder? Because, and I'm on a Mac, so maybe it's a little bit different on Windows, but you are presented with permissions, rights management issues where you can't delete the files even though you're trying to. This is something I've never encountered on any other camera, Blackmagic, Lumix, Canon, but for some reason the Sony memory cards are just bogged down with this outdated and archaic folder structure full of a bunch of stuff I don't think anyone really needs. There has to be a better way to organize these files. And maybe it does vary from camera to camera. So I'm talking about things like the A7 IV or the A7S III or, gosh, what else have I used recently? The A7R III, I think is what I was shooting with. So this is a common enough problem for me that it's put me off to where I'm just like, I don't really want to have to deal with these files. But it is a minor gripe, a little bit of a nitpick, and something where I go, okay, I can understand why people would get past this for all the benefits, right? For the dynamic range, for the resolution, for the face tracking autofocus, the eye tracking, all that stuff, you know, the lens selection, like these are all great benefits, and I'll let the folder structure slide a little bit. But I think that's unfortunate that there's not more people talking about it going like, this doesn't make any sense. We should fix this. Like Sony ought to do something. And so I guess I would just throw my minor complaint out there. Speaking of memory cards, the other thing I find really irritating on the Sony cameras, and it does vary, I think now by model, but it always seems like the memory cards are backwards and upside down. And if you've shot with certain of these camera models, you'll understand what I'm saying, where most cameras, you put the memory card in where like the label is facing you, but on a lot of Sony models, you put it the other way, where the little metal chips on the back, that part that actually like, you know, reads and writes data, that's facing you, which is, again, okay, fine. Maybe a lot of people just get used to it and that feels normal for them. But then also there's certain Sony models where the slot 1 is the bottom slot and slot 2 is the top slot. There's just a lot of stuff that feels backwards to me. And again, I'm sure you get used to it and it just is normal, you know, for a lot of people. But when we have these like varying standards between different cameras, if you have even in the Sony ecosystem where certain models are laid out differently, it becomes very confusing on set when you're working with other people, making sure that like, hey, did you format slot 1? You know, to make sure you format slot 1, not slot 2, and it can easily lead to mistakes. And again, it's a super tiny nitpick deal, but it's that friction that I experience anytime I'm using these Sony cameras where I really have to check and make sure, okay, which way does the card need to go in? Which slot does it need to be in? And it's just a minor irritation and just super frustrating. And I don't know why, because on a lot of other cameras, it just, you know, it feels more intuitive. It feels easy to use. And I think that's kind of one of the number one things when it comes to consumer satisfaction. Is the product easy enough to use, or is it confusing? And that mental load every single time just adds up. Super tiny nitpick. Obviously, we can look past it for all those great benefits, things like autofocus, etc. But then you get into the camera and you're going through the menu, and no matter how many times these camera companies say that they've updated the menu and now it makes more sense, I'll get into the Sony cameras and you're wondering, okay, like which picture profile do I need to shoot in? Everyone says S-Log3 is the best. Okay, but what picture profile is? Well, that's PP10 or maybe it's PP11. Is it PP9? I can't really remember. And it's not obvious or intuitive in any which way. It's something you have to learn and understand, which is fine, but then training someone or working with another person across a different team, it's very difficult to manage, especially because you can customize all these picture profiles as well. So let's say I don't even remember what it is, and it might even change between the camera models, but there's no consistency or ease of use where I want to put it in S-Log3 and there's an S-Log3 mode. You have to go into the picture profiles, but then the picture profiles also overlay with the creative styles. There's a lot of options when it comes to color management on these Sony cameras. And at a certain point, options are good. I do appreciate them, but when they're laid out in a way that makes more intuitive sense rather than navigating through what feels like to me almost like a TV menu, or like I've compared the Sony cameras to like TV remotes in the past, where there's a lot of buttons, there's a lot of functionality, but none of it really is intuitive or makes sense, or you can't really get to what you're looking for quickly. It's too many layers of complexity that, again, it creates that friction where I'm willing to look past it for the benefits, the technological feats that these cameras offer, but the actual using it day to day is super frustrating and kind of bogs you down, where other camera systems are almost a joy to use because they're so easy, they're so intuitive. And don't get me wrong, I don't think any camera company does it perfectly, but there are clear winners and losers when it comes to how these cameras perform and how easy it is to operate them. So when I'm looking at the Sony cameras, we've got the E-mount, great lens selection, like it's been around forever. So there's some clear reasons why you might want to be invested in Sony. And I really like the fact that they have cameras all the way down to like a very basic consumer level, all the way up to your cinema grade cameras. And those lenses work across the board for all of them. But then, unfortunately, a lot of these cameras, aside from the high-end cinema ones, but like the maybe mid-tier prosumer, are marketed for their video features. It'll say 4K, it'll say things like 6K, it'll say oversampled or undersampled or whatever marketing lingo they like to use when it comes to the video features. They'll say how it's, 422 10-bit, how you can do X, Y, and Z in the video modes and all the frame rates and all the benefits. And yet it's very hard to actually find the Sony camera that doesn't overheat. And there are some of them, but they tend to be the much more expensive models that don't overheat in the video mode. And everyone will say, well, you're buying a photography camera. Don't expect, if you want a video camera, buy a video camera. But I think it's kind of misleading to talk about the video features as much as they do on some of these models, and yet those are the same models that are plagued by overheating. The A7 IV is one example that I can think of where, yes, it has incredible video features. There's people who will talk about how it's one of the best Sony cameras for video, and yet you're constantly worried in the back of your mind, is this thing going to overheat? And what ends up happening is every person who's interested in maybe the A7 IV ends up having to look at the higher price point. And when you compare that to what other companies are doing, so this isn't, Sony in a vacuum where, these cameras at like the $2,000 price point overheat. If you want the ones that don't overheat, look at the $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 price point. There's a lot of other camera companies that are offering cameras at the $2,000 or $1,500 price point that don't overheat. And so when you're comparing, apples to apples, or trying to, find your way through the industry and figure out, okay, well, for $2,000 and you're looking at a spec sheet and this one can do 4K and that one can do 4K and this one does 10-bit 422 and that one does 10-bit 422 and this does 60 frames and that does 60 frames. On a spreadsheet, they all look very, very similar in terms of features. But in actual functionality, when you take it out into the field and you're shooting with something like the A7 IV, you run up into those kind of shutdown moments where the camera overheats and says, no, sorry, I can't do all those amazing things I told you I could do anymore. Now you've got to let me cool down. Now you got to work around it. You got to build your rig with like a special fan attachment, or you need to do all this extra stuff, jump through all these extra hoops to actually get those features out of the camera. And I think that's really unfortunate because there's other cameras at a very similar price point that aren't plagued by those issues. So when I'm looking at it and going, which one do I pick? Am I going to pick the $2,000 camera that might overheat from time to time, or the one that doesn't overheat? Again, the specs are more or less the same nowadays across the board. Nikon, Canon, Sony, Lumix, they all have their advantages and disadvantages. But for the most part, it's not like back in the day where we were comparing 4K to 1080p, or we were comparing 10-bit to 8-bit, or we were looking at 422 versus 420. Almost all of these modern, hybrid prosumer enthusiast cameras can do the same things, but certain ones coming from Sony are still limited. And I can't say it's artificially, right? That was the issue with the Canon R5, where there was this like thermal management built in where it would shut the camera down and you'd have to reset the timer. And it was all kind of arbitrary. The camera wasn't actually overheating. It was more of a software limitation. The Sony cameras, I think, do get exceptionally hot and they do run warm. And they're just not factoring in the fact that they need some kind of thermal management in terms of hardware, like a fan or venting solution. And there's a lot of people out there who will say, I don't need that in my photography camera. I like that it's weather sealed and I'm not worried about, water or air or dust getting in there. And that's perfectly valid. But I'm talking from my perspective where I'm looking at these cameras that are all on the market, that are offered at various price points. And, you have to go with your budget at the end of the day, and wondering why so many people are choosing the Sony camera, knowing these limitations are there, having to constantly fight and battle these problems or issues or minor irritations constantly. Why would you pick that when you have $2,000 to spend and you could spend it kind of anywhere? And again, I know Sony is popular for a lot of reasons, but those reasons for me aren't enough anymore because, again, spec for spec, most of the cameras nowadays are relatively the same. So if you have to shoot Sony because that's the ecosystem and the world that you live in, because everyone else shoots Sony around you and it won the popularity contest in your market, well, then unfortunately you're kind of stuck. And I can understand why people have to like creep up their budget ladder and they can't, find the perfect camera for $1,500 or $2,000. They have to spend $3,000 or $4,000 to make it happen. And I think that's just such a unfortunate result, because when you're looking at budget, do you buy one camera? A lot of times you might need two cameras. And when you're always spending more to get the thing that works reliably, you're limiting yourself, your resources, like what you can bring, the size of your footprint. And a lot of people will say, well, budget doesn't matter because you're going to make all that back doing the work. The clients are going to pay for it in the long run. So you buy the best, you spend as much as, spend it all and get the best of the best, because who cares? You're going to make it back if you're a working professional. But I just don't think that's realistic for a lot of people. A lot of people are either just getting started or they're kind of scraping to get by, trying to figure out ways to make it all work. And these are just tools. And when you use that word tool, I think of Home Depot or Lowe's. And if you went to Home Depot and you bought a drill and, the person working there told you, yeah, that one's the best drill, but it'll overheat, half the time on you. You're going, well, man, that's going to really limit my capability of building and using said drill, constructing whatever it might be. And you might think, well, like, what's the difference between this drill and that drill? Well, that one's just as good and that one doesn't overheat. I think it'd be a clear winner as to which one you would pick, because these are tools, right? They're tools to make images, to make movies, to make videos, to make content, and let alone all the other quirks that the Sony cameras still don't have, things like open gate, shutter angle. It's irritating enough, all those things added up, for where I look at it and I go, well, shoot, maybe autofocus isn't the one killer feature that I need if it comes with so much baggage attached to it, if it comes with so many of these irritations. And yes, there's great things to love about the things that Sony has added, IBIS, in addition to the higher frame rates. Like these are great options to have on the Sony cameras. And I can understand why someone would pick the features over everything. But for me, most of those features aren't useful if the camera is actually overheated and I literally cannot use it anymore. So that's a big pain point for me, probably one of the biggest, just the unreliable nature of a camera that says it can do X, Y, and Z, and then when you actually put it to the test, it just doesn't. And then you look at the market and you see other cameras with equivalent, I can't say identical, but similar enough specs, and you go, okay, I'll pick the thing that's far more reliable. I think you'd probably say the same thing of people too, right? If you were hiring the best of the best person, your camera operator, colorist, editor, if half the time they don't feel like waking up and they show up late, or they have to leave early every time, or maybe their like rate fluctuates too much, or there's just like inconsistency, I think you might end up picking the person who's like pretty good, really good, and is super reliable. I don't know why I view the world that way so often, but consistency, reliability. It's what clients come to expect. So it's what I expect from my gear and my equipment. And I know there will always be people saying, well, just buy the more expensive one. That's the one you really want. And even then, it still usually doesn't have everything I need. And I'm also limited by the silly, folder structure and some of those other like minor tiny gripes. So it's not like it's not a situation where I want to use the Sony cameras. I will if I have to because of those features. If I need ultra high resolution, yeah, the Sony A7R series is kind of your choice. Back in the day, I needed low light capabilities, and so I chose an A7S from time to time because I needed those low light capabilities. If there's other times where, if I really, really, really needed autofocus, I might go with something like an A7 whatever series. But if I had to pick my tool that I'm going to use every single day, if I have to pick up that drill at Home Depot and buy, with my money to go work on client paid projects, if I have the choice, I'm going to go with the one that does the job reliably every time. I can push it to its limit and it still holds up and serves me well in a way that is intuitive and obvious and just makes sense. And those are the things that I value more than, is the autofocus, perfect. Well, a lot of times I'm not relying on autofocus. Sometimes I am. And nowadays with all the cameras have phase detect. So it's pretty good across the board. Is it better on Sony? Maybe. But at what cost? And those are the things that I'm always weighing out when I do have the choice. If I'm limited to my choice because I need a particular feature, then yeah, Sony probably makes sense for that particular project. But if I have to pick my tool, then my favorite, it's probably not going to be a Sony until they fix some of these issues that have been plaguing them for years that unfortunately far too many people just kind of glance over. They just look past. They say, that's not that big of a deal. I'll just work with it. I'll figure it out. It's fine. I don't think it should be fine though. I think these things should be getting better. Yes, the features should get better. Autofocus, IBIS, resolution, dynamic range, color, all that should get better. But I think also just the ease of using the camera should get better too. We shouldn't take it for granted how clunky some of these things are. And I realize it's super nitpicky of me, but when I have my choice, I want to go with the thing that's more or less effortless and easy to use. One other thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about how everything was backwards and kind of upside down in these cameras, another one that's super silly, tiny little nitpick, but even the ISO menu, the ISO, when you're picking that, you go down to go higher. And I don't know, there's just those weird little things that it feels backwards. It feels wrong to me. You can obviously get used to it, totally fine. But when I'm picking my ISO, like higher numbers go up or to the right. That's just the way I feel like almost everything like works and functions like out of intuition. Maybe that's a very like American thing. And at the end of the day, you can get used to it. It's fine, going down for higher ISO values. Like it's not that big of a deal. But when you consider like all the pieces, how everything kind of feels a little bit off, a little bit wrong, a little bit like this should be different to be more intuitive. And that's the clunkiness that I continue to find with the Sony cameras. They're fine. They're workable. They're usable. They can get the job done as gosh knows. The market shows it. Plenty of people are super happy with the Sony cameras. So I know I'm a little bit of an anomaly, a little bit weird, a little bit strange. But when I'm using cameras, I don't know. That's the stuff that bothers me the most, honestly. Because yeah, if you say it's got great 4K, it's got autofocus, I'm like, okay, great. I need those things to work right. But then the day-to-day using it, copying the cards, pushing the buttons on the camera, that's where it like really grates on me, And I feel like that's across the board in like cars, vehicles. There's like little quirks, little oddities that even though it's the best car, you might say like, this isn't the one I want to use as my daily driver because X, Y, and Z really bug me. And that's kind of how I feel about these Sony cameras. I love them for what they've done in terms of specs and hardware and features, pushing things forward. But I'm also constantly disappointed by all those little limitations and irritations that at the end of the day feel kind of arbitrary to me. It seems like there ought to be a better solution for these things, because it's not asking for, I need something absurd, something impossible. It's all very, very well done in other cameras and other models. So like there is an answer. These aren't impossible problems without a solution. The answer in almost all of these situations is very clear, and yet we're still held back. At least that's how I feel anytime I'm shooting with some of these Sony cameras. Again, no hate, just pointing it out as why I find it a little clunky to use them from time to time.